Hey, people. Today I am here with Brett Scott, who writes the Altered States of Monetary Consciousness Substack newsletter and is the author of a few books, Cloud Money, Cash Cards, Crypto, and the War for Our Wallets, and The Heretic's Guide to Global Finance, Hacking the Future of Money. Yeah, Brett and I last hung out in person at the Medicine Festival in England, which was a great time. And we kept
It
running
was good. It was good.
over and over again in different human configurations. That was exciting. And
Yeah.
you're from South Africa.
I'm from South Africa. Yes.
You're based in Berlin.
Strange. South Africa is for the first time in a long time getting weird global prominence because of, well, Musk being this, South African and also David Sachs. And it's quite weird because suddenly we're getting this quite bad press of
Yeah.
these white South Africans from the kind of 1980s generation, well, 1970s actually, who
Yeah.
suddenly, um, so yeah.
Well, I'm
Um,
actually excited about South Africa because I have a think tank or an incubator. I'm not quite sure exactly what to call it, called the Elevator.Earth,
mhm.
that I started with Tarol Newstad in Norway, who runs the Catapult Fund and Catapult Future Fest. And it's still very nascent kind of a thing. The idea is to sort of try to elevate global consciousness and also kind of, yeah, think about what could be an alternative paradigm to reductive materialism,
Oh,
uh,
sweet.
taking taking into account, quantum physics and, people like Bernardo Kastrup and Donald Hoffman who are kind of arguing for idealism. And yeah, kind of thinking that kind of ontology is something that people don't often think about as being important, politically, socially, and ecologically and financially, but actually it kind of defines, yeah, how people relate to their reality. And if there was an ontological shift, from reductive materialism to, let's say, idealism, that might actually have a lot of impacts on, yeah, just how people conceive themselves in relationship with each other in the world and so on.
Yeah,
So,
I've seen you've done some pieces around that. I need to delve more into that somehow when I get a
yeah,
chance.
it's kind of my little, bailiwick. You have
One of
your
your
bailiwick, but
yeah.
yeah, I really, I
So
think
wait, how does South Africa figure in that? You say you got
oh,
you
because we found an executive director who is
cool.
a amazing South African woman from a Zulu background, Ashanti Kuneni. She was actually
Nice.
working with Culture Hack Labs for a while. You probably know those guys. And yeah, she does a lot of cool stuff. And yeah, I love her. I'm excited. I'm really excited about her. And somehow it felt very kind of yeah, it feels very proper at the moment to sort of elevate, a black woman from South Africa and as a sort of counteractive to everybody
As a
else.
counter to yeah, the others.
Yeah.
Good work.
Okay, so yeah, I wanted to reach out to you because I mean, we just, before I turned on the recording. Oh, and by the way, people, blah blah blah, subscribe, like all that stuff. Forever, sell your soul and fealty to the YouTube channel, whatever you're supposed to do. But yeah, I've been thinking recently about. I mean, you were saying that you don't really follow politics on a regular basis. Which I admire. I've gotten sort of mired into, kind of trying to figure out
Well,
what's
I do follow. I just don't throw myself in every hour.
yeah, 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 yeah. I've been kind of like yeah, trying to understand. I mean, I was, about a month and a half before the election, I started to realize that it was, I found the idea of Trump winning to be, worse than I had conceived of. And somehow I didn't think he was going to win. I thought this is just not going to happen somehow. And then of course he did win. Maybe fairly, maybe there was some shenanigans there or chicanery, I guess is the word, behind the scenes. I know we talked about the Musk-Trump fusion into Mump or
Mump. Yeah.
Trusk or whatever, Tusk. Um, but yeah, there was Tusk talked about anything could be hacked, and yeah, there's some weird little things about the voting machines nobody wants to talk about. But anyway, um, yeah, so and obviously one of the things that's coming up strong with this new Tusk situation, or Musk, Mump, is the cryptocurrency, and
Mm.
a lot of enthusiasm around crypto. And I just feel in my heart like I just don't love Bitcoin. And I have a lot of friends who have become very wealthy on Bitcoin and love Bitcoin. And yeah, I guess I wanted to talk to you a little bit about why is everybody going so crazy for this thing? Because you've written about it pretty intensively, sort of seeing it as more like a speculative commodity, or sort of a almost like I think you described it as almost like a trading card, kind of like a
Limited
collectible.
edition numerical nouns.
Yeah, exactly. Um, and
I've
yeah,
tracked
so
Bitcoin for a long time. I mean, I was involved in the early Bitcoin
well, I
community.
hope you bought some too. You probably didn't.
I've never actually bought Bitcoin. I've earned it Bitcoin.
Yeah, that's the thing. I don't want to buy it, but if people give it to me, that's
Well,
nice.
in the early days of Bitcoin, I actually tried to use it as a currency.
Yeah,
I mean, I'm probably one of the few people in the world who's ever done that. I mean, it's because it isn't the currency, right? But I was interested in the early days when it was still a kind of nascent thing and it was like an experimental phase. I was involved in lots of alternative currency movements, and I was intrigued about how you would turn it into a currency. So I would accept payment in it. I paid interns in it. I did all sorts of stuff with it. Paid for like loads of things, my rent and things in Bitcoin and stuff. So I had a lot of experience with the Bitcoin world. But of course, it's gone through multiple phases over time.
yeah,
And so the phase one, like the innocent phase, then phase two, the sort of speculation started kicking in. Then the kind of hodler generation emerged, all these people who just like obsessed about holding it. Then there was the FTX scandal, which kind of like hit the whole legitimacy of the industry very big. And then now the latest wave is the kind of Trump political manipulation of the market. Essentially, they're going to pump the price as a political project. Um, and of course, that's why everyone's interested right now because all the fund managers are getting involved. All the ETFs have been set up, so all the big institutional money is pouring in, plus the US state. So then every single person in society then also thinks to themselves, "Oh, we better get in too, because if we miss out on this." I was just riding in Berlin and on the street that there were all these like adverts right now, being like, "Have you yet got into Bitcoin?" Basically trying to play on that FOMO, and that will work.
yeah.
So that's the latest phase.
So yeah, but I always try to like step back and try to understand what the hell is happening on maybe more like meta systemic levels. Like
Mm.
right now, I'm really intrigued by like the Antonio Gramsci's ideas around like a crisis of hegemony,
Hmm.
and that actually what we're seeing with the sort of rise of like Christian nationalism and fascism, you know, represents, yeah, some kind of hegemonic crisis for, Western capitalist civilization, that the sort of liberal progressive consensus wasn't really offering people anything anymore in terms of like meaning or purpose or function, or future. So this whole new thing has jump started, has grown. I also think like although they don't take it, they won't acknowledge the climate emergency, which is also what I think is leading to like the refugee crises all over the world, is an underlying driver of the sort of right wing, neo-fascist populism or whatever that's rising up.
Yeah.
And another lens that now I'm looking at actually through Alexander Biner. In one of his essays, he talked about Peter Turchin, who wrote a book called End Times, elites, counter elites, and political disintegration, I think is the book. And Turchin is a historian who uses mathematical models. So he basically argues that there's a sort of inherent cyclical thing that happens where wealth concentrates in a small group. They then reach a point where they sort of take over the leverage of society, where they turn the whole rest of the society into a wealth pump that pumps the wealth up to the small elite group. This leads to like a immiseration of the masses, which then leads to resentment and fury. And it also leads to a situation that he calls elite overproduction, where you have too many people in the elite group vying for too few power spots. So these
Mm.
two conditions ultimately then lead to breakdown, revolution, civil war. And he basically argues that the U.S. has entered into that disintegration stage.
Okay,
Um,
yeah, interesting.
so yeah, those are different, lenses. But then I'm also kind of like, looking at it from the lens of like, it tends to be that when you have, I don't necessarily love to use the word fascism, but something like a sort of, authoritarian right wing and anti-democratic regime that comes into power and holds power, what's the dynamic that like breaks them out of power? I mean, I guess sometimes they get exhausted or they run out of steam, but often it requires like a war, like obviously with, Nazi Germany, it required all of Europe kind of like joining force, Europe and then America coming in, but there's no other America waiting in the wings to kind
Mm.
of contest authoritarianism. And yeah, so I don't know as we go into this how we ever get out of it. And that so it's a big that's sort of where I'm thinking right now. But then also yeah, so like, and what role is crypto playing, or other insights into the financial system as a whole, which and I'm sorry for such a long, meandering, not even a question kind of thing. But I mean, if we look at 2008 and how, yeah, and essentially like the financial, system kind of collapsed in 2008, and maybe ever since then it's been kind of like a somewhat of a fraud, in that we never fixed the underlying dynamics of it, and we just, created more financial capital and gave it out to these institutions that were, yeah, like
Yeah.
where are you at? What's your diagnosis? What are you thinking? I'm sorry,
Well,
there's a lot
so,
there to mess
well, I
around with.
mean, maybe on your first story, what was the first story was around
Or hegemony,
the crisis of the story, maybe.
the crisis of the story. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that's a complex one because the news story coming out is a bit like convoluted and a bit contradictory. But obviously, there's a new ideological hybrid that's been formed, um, with the whole kind of Trump thing, or the sort of populist right more generally. But
The hybrid
I,
being between,
this kind of is sort of like, I mean, I think there's a whole kind of resurgence of some kind of libertarian ideology on the one hand, all right, which is always hanging around in the background of capitalism, right? But there's a whole bunch of the quite hard libertarian ideas coming out, mixed in then with all these kind of protectionist ideas and stuff like that, which actually can sort of quasi be left wing in certain forms, right? So there are these sort of quote unquote left wing elements to the Trump program, which I mean, they're not necessarily left wing, but they could be used in these sort of contexts, right? You could imagine them as sort of, worker protection type of efforts. They're not sort of like globalization, financial globalization kind of tropes, right? So in a previous wave of capitalism, with your kind of big tech and finance as your big players, they're all about destroy friction, make everything global, like, very standard acceleration and expansion stories, um, which is a basic underlying tendency of capitalism anyway, right? Like a capitalist system always wants to expand and get faster, like de facto, as a sort of as like a baseline default tendency. But then there are obviously different interest groups within that who are vying for different forms of power. And so that story is particularly prevalent in the financial and tech elites. Um, but obviously there's like fighting within the different capitalist classes, right? So like, um, Trump has gone in and sort of sided with various parts of that group and doesn't necessarily operate in the interests of like financial capital, for example. So there's those kind of things happening. In terms of the actual, just on that point of like the elite overproduction thing, I mean, and also in any economic system, there's going to be points where it hits when it's trying to expand and it hits barriers, right? This is a kind of like an old sort of Marxist sort of thing. It's like, your system can only expand so much before it stagnates, right? It hits against barriers, and various industries who have previously enriched themselves in those frontiers start to stagnate. And then you've had these sort of new capitalist classes emerging in somewhere else in the system. So right now, the current wave of new capitalist overlords being created are in the crypto sector, right? So there's a whole new wave of those people, and I think Trump is aligned with them. So they got a bunch of money from that industry. So they weren't previously favored by the previous regimes, right? So they've managed to get favor with this particular regime and get this regime to focus on them. But then I think ideologically, the crypto sector works very well for Trump because it carries the same story that he tells. So his story has always been something like vaguely, the system is rigged. He has, I think, I mean, in my sense of Trump is he has this kind of, he goes around with the system is rigged, but then he doesn't question the underlying idea that you should compete and win at all costs. What his main complaint tends to be something like, we're all trying to compete, but there's some kind of swamp elite that's stopping you from truly succeeding in the market. And therefore we destroy the swamp. And then that's why you then suddenly flourish as a kind of underlying group of people, individuals, right? So you become winners rather than losers. And so the crypto industry actually has a lot of that kind of populist finance vibe, which is like, finance for the little man. And it also has a lot of this kind of jeering winners versus losers thing going on. Right. So Trump, the alternative narrative, of course, if you're faced with a corrupt system, is you say we should form bottom-up solidarity and collective power and join unions, right? That's the kind of left-wing perspective.
I like that. That sounds good to me.
Trump doesn't do that.
No.
He's like, yes, the system is corrupt, but what we need to do is take out one group of elites and then you fight your way to the top. Right. Like that's the kind of thing. And the crypto industry works very well for him for that, because I mean, he's very obviously engaged in a new plutocratic project of enriching a new group of capitalists, or an old group as well, right? A bunch of Silicon Valley people. But he will enrich.
Yeah, but also his his treasury secretary kind of nominee is from the mainstream system. He worked with George Soros and stuff like that.
Yeah, and I think they don't really care that much about the cognitive dissonance of this. I mean, it's sort of like they're like, well, yeah. They've managed to capture the narrative such that they have this license to just at least temporarily engage in outright plutocracy. But then they can say things like, well, we're opening up the gambling halls for the common person, go and speculate on the new crypto ETF and something, like that's so the whole sort of meme stock.
That is the situation. I mean, obviously.
Yeah, I mean, that's
particularly when you have New York. Like an Americano coffee, which used to be like $2, is now $6.50. In my local cafe.
Yeah. And they're going to play on that. And so that underlying economic stress that's probably hitting the kind of lower middle class, especially people like that who are on the verge of being pushed into poverty, who, especially in the States, where doesn't have the kind of European style social welfare states. Like it's you get pushed off the bottom, you're screwed. So it's quite an interesting project you have there where on the one hand, he's got Elon and crew about to engage in some kind of austerity program, which seems to involve gutting various parts of the state, while simultaneously being like, yeah, but you're going to get a chance to like enrich yourself through crypto. And this becomes very important. So things like the Bitcoin strategic reserve that they're talking about, if their political gambit is going to be like, well, if we've told people that they're going to become rich off crypto, and crypto markets are inherently, especially Bitcoin, is inherently circular, right? And we can go into why that's the case. But that's a big political risk, because if the markets tank, suddenly everyone's like, yeah, but you said the crypto markets were going to go up. So what do? You get the US state to buy up crypto to keep the market. You manipulate the price, essentially. So that's, to me, the strategic reserve is very obviously an attempt to manipulate the crypto price for the political project to succeed. Basically handing out patronage, as it were, to the people in the crypto. And the main patronage is actually to the crypto elites, right? The sort of new wave of the big holders of those tokens, right? But the sort of trickle down element for the people who are holding small holdings of crypto, they get like enough they sort of feel like, okay, well, we've won in some way from the system.
Right.
But bear in
Well,
mind,
yeah. Well, go ahead.
the number of people holding crypto is incredibly tiny, actually. And if you think about at a global level, at least, right? But it's mostly among your kind of sort of middle class, lower middle class people who hold small amounts. And so you can sort of plausibly claim that you're doing something for people by pushing the price up. But if a person's holding, 2,000 bucks worth of it, then it goes to 4,000, right? So then they make a small amount, which makes them feel like they've got something. But of course, the massive beneficiaries are people who are holding huge amounts of the stuff, right? Because they become completely.
And as you noted in your article, those are the people who in 2009 happened to be in the right circles and have like,
Yeah, yeah.
advanced
I mean,
understanding of certain tech protocols and stuff like that.
the actual distribution is like insane. Um, And of course, there's a lot of ideology in the crypto sector designed to combat critique of this. So they'll say things like, "Oh well, but you can break it down into small little pieces. It's like it's like taking gold and grinding it down into gold dust, and sort of being like, well, look, you can have an atomic particle of gold for you there, right? But the point is if somebody's holding 2 tons of gold and you're holding a particle of gold, they have an immense amount of power relative to you. Okay, so the point isn't that you can grind Bitcoin into tiny little pieces and sort of spread it around, but in the end, there's like, you know, very small number of people holding an enormous amount of that thing that then is drifting down. Now that would be a serious problem if it was actually a monetary system, but it isn't the monetary system. It's just an asset, right? So um, right now, the main effect is going to be to try to essentially enrich a particular new elite. And there's particular ideological justifications I come across for this in the crypto sector because what some people in that scene say, they have this kind of manifest destiny story where they say things like, well, what happened in the beginning of Bitcoin was that all the liberty-minded people, this particular kind of person was attracted to this, almost like evolutionarily attracted they saw the potential. And these people will inherit the earth because they're basically going to become extremely enriched as the US state pumps the price. And then they will be in positions of power. And then they will be in this position to liberate humanity as a whole, right? Because all the positions of power are going to be held with the sort of new plutocratic libertarian elite who became insanely wealthy through the US state pumping this assets class.
Yeah, it sounds terrifying.
I mean, but that's a justification that they will use because
Yeah.
if you look at the actual distribution of the tokens, it's incredibly unequal. So to
Hmm.
justify the unequal distribution, you have to say it was given to a rightful elite who will then use their power for the good of the world to liberate everyone, and that's what they will believe.
So what is like, what is somebody like you or I do or people we know like, there's a part of me that, does assume it is going to keep rising in value. And I'm like, oh, should I take my scanty little savings and like throw it into the casino? Or am I just going to get swindled? Because every time I've tried to do something like that, I always be the last one in and before the thing, melts down again. Even on a very tiny level, like a play money level,
I mean,
Uh,
I personally don't get
yeah,
involved
yeah.
because I try to maintain my integrity in this, and also it's important for me to not get involved because people who get too caught up in crypto, it's like it takes over their
Yeah,
mind, right? It's
totally.
like a kind of,
Totally.
it's
I
a
can't stand
viral
it.
life form that they
Yeah.
then they'll start to create all these elaborate justifications for what's
Yeah.
going on, right?
I think
Um,
I think it partially ruined like Burning Man and the transformational festival movement also
it's
because
ruined
like
many people, yeah.
well no because I remember back in like 2000 11 12 13 people had a sense of like oh the ecological crisis is like really severe and like the sort of spiritual movement somehow needs to connect with changing society and then crypto came up and everybody a lot of those people just gravitated towards that
Yeah,
and then
yeah.
then just became focused on personal
You
enrichment.
know, I was saw this video the other day from one of these kind of like commune type places in Bali or something, where the sort of spiritual travelers of the world gravitate towards. And there was some video of this guy doing this rap, and it was a kind of a spiritual rap where he was riffing on like the powers of be that control the world and how like screw you, but we're gonna get the indigenous people crypto wallets. And like, okay, so it's like this was the solution. The indigenous people are gonna get crypto wallets, and this is gonna somehow. So this kind of magical thinking, right? And it's sort of uh yeah, it is a very interesting life form, crypto. And one of the things about Bitcoin, which is so fascinating, is just how empty it is. And this is partly why it's successful. So um if you actually look at what Bitcoin is, I mean, it's numbers that you write out after you expend energy. I mean, if you have to give a, is it the word ontological? I mean, like a kind of what, like the sort of like this, that the act like what is it at like a sort of level of reality? It's like literally a guy writes out 50, and that's it. Okay, then you can split it into pieces. But there's a whole process behind that. It's restricted. It's very hard to do that process. It's hard to write the number out. Right. And that's the sort of proof of work stuff in Bitcoin. But in the end, if you say, what is the thing that you created here? It's like I wrote out a number, right? So the whole fascinating thing about Bitcoin is that that's simultaneously incredibly weak. And it's also quite strong in the sense that, um, like if I have, for example, this cup of lemon tea here, that has an inherent use to a human being. You don't have to convince somebody about that thing's use. It's like, well, it's lemon tea. It has a particular thing, right? But also there's limitations to how fixated people can get on it because they know what it is, right? At some point they're like, well, I have enough lemon tea. It's sort of, it's not going to be a speculative asset. Whereas a totally empty like object that has no features to it is actually incredibly captivating to people in many ways. All right, this is one of the reasons why Bitcoin's so resilient, but also why it's so incredibly volatile, because nobody has any idea what it actually is. And what it is it's numbers written out after you expend energy. So it has to have this entire sort of marketing apparatus for people to continue to believe or to sort of buy into this idea. But it's inherently circular in the way it works. So it'll always be incredibly vulnerable to crashes, unless it's subject to manipulation, which is what the US state wants to do now. I mean, you could delve into the monetary theory parts of this, right? Because from a monetary perspective, it isn't money, right? It's just a digital object that you can move that has a price. But it sort of looks like money. It has the superficial surface appearance of a monetary system. And this is why it's such a kind of
Right. Well,
mind fuck for people.
I
So
mean, you addressed it in this piece, but I think it's always worth sort of like going back to this. Like a lot of people would say, like, the US dollar, fiat currency is also just made up, and there's really no difference. Um, I have my own refutation for that, but I'm curious how you would express yours.
well, there is a difference between the act of me writing a number out and a gigantic, powerful state that has the ability to coerce taxation from people and has like military bases all over the world and fighter jets and incredible cultural power. I mean, like a credit instrument issued by the US government is of a fundamentally different sort of thing to a object that just has numbers, right? They appear before you. They might look the same. Like you look at a dollar bill, it has numbers written on it, right? And a Bitcoin has numbers written on it. But one of them is a gigantic kind of credit vortex. Now, if you think about a monetary system, I mean, I don't know how trippy you want to get here, but you've got to kind of think about it in like three dimensions.
What's that?
You got to think about it in three dimensions. So
Hmm.
it's a three-dimension. I mean, I think about it in three dimensions.
Mhm.
There's like a horizontal dimension to it and a vertical dimension to it. Um, the horizontal dimension is kind of like all about human interdependence, right? The fact that humans are interdependent, we depend upon each other, but we go in and out of credits and debt to each other in the process of being interdependent, right? So I do something, I'm going positive, you do something, and so on, right? So if you look at my hands, like that point there is a point of equality. But when people go out of equality, one person goes positive, another person goes negative, right? That's what the primitive in a monetary system is somebody going positive and another person going negative, right? So all positive units in a monetary system actually have to have a negative counterpart somewhere else in the system, all right? For in a situation of interdependence, all right? So money is not merely an asset, it also has a liabilities side, all right? And that's a kind of on the sort of that would happen, for example, if you were in a very small scale hunter-gatherer band or something like that. Or an example I might use is like, let's say you get shipwrecked on an island with 5 other people, and you find yourself having to survive together. And you say, hey, we all have to pull our weight, and I'm going to do something, and then you're going to go into debt, but then you also have to do something, and you could form an accounting system in that situation where you measure people going in and out of debts to each other. Normally, we don't do that in small scale situations, but you could. All right. So that's the sort of horizontal dimension. But for that to work at a very, very large scale, or how modern capitalist systems are constructed, is that you have that, but then you also have this huge vertical dimension, which is that you have these massive issuers of units of money that other people use in their interdependent situations. So I know that sounds a bit complicated, but the state and the banking sector essentially now form the negative. Whenever you see a positive unit of money, there's a negative somewhere else in the system, in the banking sector and in the state, right? There's actually a bunch of layers of money. So, money appears before us as a sort of object that has numbers on it, but it has this whole sort of legal structural apparatus, but then also this whole kind of network structure as well with interdependence. Now, that whole like three-dimensional vortex is incredibly powerful and incredibly hard to break out of, right? Yeah. Now, the mere act of presenting somebody with something that has the superficial appearance of money, all right? So you say something like, here is something that has a number and a symbol next to it, 1 BTC. It's true that a person who's immersed in a large-scale capitalist system might not actually be able to tell the difference between that and the monetary units that they use, because most people aren't trained to see the whole structure of a system that they're immersed in, right? So it's very easy to confuse people with this. And this is what Bitcoin does in many ways. It kind of has this sort of almost viral-like quality where it sort of has this ability to appear before people as if it was a monetary system, when really what it is an object priced within a monetary system. And if you have an object priced within a monetary system, any object, it could be this T here, it could be this microphone, it could be anything. Any priced object can be used for exchange through a process called counter trade. And counter trade is a process where you use something's resale price to buy stuff. Okay, so Bitcoin works purely through counter trade in the sense that if you're trying to quote unquote buy something with Bitcoin, what you actually do is you look at what its US dollar price is, and then you compare that US dollar price to the price of the thing you're trying to buy, and then you work out a counter trade ratio to work out how much Bitcoin you'd have to give for that kind of thing. The example I used in this recent piece I did was like, imagine you're in your house and the boiler repair guy has come and he's finished fixing your boiler, but you owe him $100, right? But you don't have $100 on you, but you do have a vintage vase on your desk that costs $100, and you say, hey, you could resell this for $100. Do you want to take this as in that situation, you're not paying him with the vase, you're actually paying him with the resale price of the vase, right? And this is how the Bitcoin system works. But because it is an object that's disguised as money rather than being, for example, a vase, which is easy to see what it is, people often mistake that process of counter trade for a process of monetary exchange. This takes kind of a while for people's minds to get around, but
that helps.
It's an incredibly successful.
I think I basically finally got it. Finally, so sometimes when I read your stuff, I feel like my brain is like trying to like clock it. I was even going to suggest to you that you could try using ChatGPT to sometimes like say write this for like a 16-year-old or something, or for a 12-year-old. It's just that little abstraction is hard to break through when it comes to thinking about monetary systems. But that made perfect sense to me.
Well, I mean, one maybe a sort of more down home kind of like example would be medallions in an antique shop.
Yeah.
Right. So if you walk into an antique shop, all the objects that you see are going to be priced within a single monetary system. Right.
Yeah.
So you'll see they all have prices on them. And like you say, there's the vintage hip flask is sitting there, and he's like, okay, that costs so much. Then you see like an old medallion. And the medallion actually has the surface appearance of being like money. It looks like money, right?
Yeah,
But
well,
it's not. It's
anything collectible and tradable, like an antique comic book or whatever. Yeah.
Yeah, but let's take something that actually looks like money,
Yeah.
right? That's sort of, and then let's say you take it, right? And you say, oh, this costs $150 or $200, whatever, and it's priced within this network. Um, if you handed that person a medallion and said, hey, can I exchange this for something? That looks like monetary exchange,
Yeah.
but you would still be counter trading using its resale price to go engage in exchange. But people often can't struggle to tell the difference between. I'm trying to think of it's okay. One last example of counter trade to help make this clear. The easiest one, people, is often when you're thinking about returning something at a shop. Okay, so let's say you buy this jacket for
Yeah.
$100. You leave the shop, right? And then you come back to the shop and say, I don't actually want this anymore. Right? And the guy says, okay, you can swap this for something of equivalent price. And so you hand it back and you get a handbag of equivalent price. Now, if out in space there were these alien anthropologists watching that interaction, and they just saw that part, they would see a person handing over a jacket, right? And they'd see a bag coming back, and they might go back and report to their planet. They're like, oh, these people use jackets as a form of money, right? They would see this interaction. But right, what was actually happening there was counter trade. You were handing back a jacket, implicitly getting $100 refund, handing the $100 back and getting a bag. Right? So the actual monetary system was the dollar system there, but it sort of superficially looks like
Right. No,
these two
I
objects.
think that's relatively clear. Yeah.
But like if for example, instead of a jacket, you had bought some kind of like money-like looking object,
Yeah.
and then you did that, it would then really would look like monetary exchange. And Bitcoin trades on this whole idea, right? It looks a lot like money. It has a sort of feeling of money, but all its interactions are completely based on counter trade. And you can always see this because if you go to look at quote unquote Bitcoin prices for things, they're constantly fluctuating as the US dollar price fluctuates. And in an actual pricing network, that doesn't happen, right? When you're buying coffee in New York, you don't see the price constantly fluctuating as, for example, its exchange rate against the euro changes. Anyway, sorry, that's quite a complex
Yeah.
part of the Bitcoin
That
system.
makes sense.
Yeah.
Well, I guess my thoughts go in a couple different directions. I mean, one is, what do you think is likely to happen in the future? I mean, with all of this, I mean, you know, my intuition, which of course could be totally wrong, is that this will be like, this will turn out to be like the subprime mortgage crisis of like
Yeah.
2000 and 28 or something like that. 20, assuming we're still alive at that point, we haven't blown ourselves up in a nuclear war. Um, or 27 or something all this speculation will go into these things. Doge, obviously, and somehow it'll spectacularly collapse. Um,
Yeah.
I don't know. And also if we look at Trump's, kind of, grifter history, like all of his businesses go bankrupt. It's like he pumps and dumps or but and then yeah, and even Musk. I mean, there's some questions about his businesses. I mean, obviously he really does create things of value, but how he does it and the effects it has. And anyway, so yeah, what as somebody who looks into all this stuff, where do you see this going on a sort of
Yeah.
mental.
Well, the reason that I focus so much on the actual deep nature of Bitcoin is that if you're interested in thinking about what it's going to happen to it in future, its deep nature makes a difference, right? Because at some deep level, it's an incredibly weak system, right? So it actually has it's really vulnerable to big price drops, precisely because it actually really has nothing holding it up, right? And this means, and in the past, when I've actually advised Bitcoin groups before, I was, how would you actually turn this into a monetary system, for example? there's really only two ways to do it with the Bitcoin system. Um, and just a little aside, the reason why the question of how do you turn it into a monetary system, the reason why that's important to consider is the only claim that Bitcoin has as an asset for why you should buy it is that it's supposed to become some future monetary system, right? It's not like shares in a company that actually makes something, or real estate that you can live in. It actually has no other story other than, well, one day this will be like the monetary system of the world. Right. So this is why that story is like, okay, so like let's hypothetically say it somehow becomes a monetary system. I mean, how would you even do that with this incredibly constrained supply thing that has this very weak structure? I mean, the sort of first way is the one that has no state intervention, which is you try to turn it into a completely fetishized object, a little bit like gold, right? Which is the crypto industry has been quite successful at doing. They've essentially taken this numbered digital object that has no real features other than you can sort of move it around. And they've created an incredibly powerful hype machine around it. And actually, if you carry on that process for long enough, it's true that it can become culturally embedded in human society. People can say, well, I know that it's just a sort of numbered thing, but we've built whole cultures around this thing now. And that kind of gives it some sort of cultural nesting in society. The other technique, which is how money actually works historically, is you get a powerful political body to stand behind it and accept it in taxation, right? To actually become the sort of create the liability side of that monetary system. So it's not just this floating object. Now, if the US state did that, if the US state came out and said, we're actually going to start authentically backing Bitcoin, accepting it for taxation and things like that, that would be a big story, big story, right? It will probably break very quickly because there's such an incredibly like limited supply system that can't handle the dynamism of a global economy. But that would be very big. I don't think that's going to actually happen. I think what's going to happen is that the Trump crew are going to pump the price for the next few years for their political project to work because they've promised all these people this thing. And at some point, it'll fall apart, right? Because the whole Bitcoin system relies upon this endless new streams of buyers coming in to keep that price up. Right. And it's important to contrast it to things like the share market, because, with shares, like actual capitalism works off massive corporations and stuff at some level, extracting profit from people. Right. And the stock market is where that gets channeled through at some point. So like, the money that comes through in the stock market at some theoretical level, at least through dividends, is coming from actual enterprises in the world, right? People actually buying and selling stuff. Profit that comes from Bitcoin is purely speculative, aka you buy it at one price and try to resell it at another price. There's nothing being produced. There's nothing happening in that system other than buying and rebuying something that's already been created. So this is why it's inherently vulnerable to crashes, which then is what requires that endless pumping up, new people coming in, new stories, and so on. And those stories are often running out. And with the FTX scandal in crypto, people were actually starting to lose belief in crypto, right? Remember, people were like, oh, I remember here, in Berlin in sort of 2019 and stuff, every party would have all these bros talking about crypto at it, right? Yep. Everyone wanted to talk about it. After the FTX thing, nobody wanted to talk about it. It was like a bit embarrassing. It was kind of cringe to talk about it, right? And that's a big problem for the crypto industry, because for them to keep that buying pressure, to keep that price up, they need people constantly talking about it. They need new people. And so I think the current wave, Trump will bring in a whole bunch of new people, but then it'll go through the same crash cycle once that pressure runs out, once that hits its limit. And so I think there could be a massive crash in terms of as all the funds and stuff start buying into it. So, when Bitcoin was still just a kind of retail investor thing, that was one thing. But now you're having all these big funds getting leveraged exposure to Bitcoin, right? They're borrowing money and buying the stuff up and getting, that's a serious systemic risk in the financial sector potentially emerging. Especially with all the ETFs and stuff. So I would say, yeah, there's a potential for something quite serious going on, especially because the price can go down so fast. Most financial assets don't go down that fast. Most financial assets can't drop 40% just like that, whereas Bitcoin can.
Hmm.
right? A change in sentiment can send a thing flying so far down, so fast, so quickly. And if all those groups are exposed to it at a large scale, that's like a financial weapon of mass destruction, right? So that's a phrase that comes from a friend of mine who was
Yeah.
talking about this. But it's so I think it's
Well,
if you catch it right, you could if you want to join the wave, but people are
yeah.
going to do. But I think it's very dangerous.
In the US, we had this recent shooting, of this healthcare executive, and it was, yeah, that's been sort of like a fascinating cultural moment. Just the level of outpouring of enthusiasm for that. And then it turns out the guy was not particularly left wing. He was like watching Peter Thiel videos and, listening to kind of like, I'm sure, some crypto stuff and so on. Yeah, I mean, did you think that points out to the sort of legitimation crisis, how fragile the legitimacy is at this point?
Yeah, I tend to go with like Grace Blakely.
I know her. I
Do,
haven't read her books yet. I've watched a few of her videos. What's her book again? It's she's coming from like a
uh,
socialist perspective, kind of like.
yeah, yeah, she's had a few books. Stolen was one of her books, and she uh, the whole sort of if you're in the situation where collective solidarity has been undermined for decades,
Yeah,
right? In the old days, in the 1950s and so on, if you were a disempowered young man, your options were slightly different. You could be like, okay, I'm being screwed. I'm going to go join a union, right? I'm going to fight for my rights. So like, unions are not sort of um kind of pie in the sky sort of ideological things. It's like this is like an actual practical method for me to protect my rights as a person who's in a disempowered situation in a capitalist economy, right? But as that ideological attack against collective action in your sort of working parts of the capitalist system has been undermined, you do sort of replacement theories that come in is like, oh well, meritocracy, you have to fight your way to the top, et cetera, et cetera. So libertarianism actually becomes this kind of basic self-help narratives.
mm,
That's what libertarianism essentially is, what the whole self-help industry works upon is like, the reason that you're doing badly in this world is that you're not trying hard enough, or you haven't thought of the right strategy yet, or, you're not quite as motivated as you should be. It's got nothing to do with the structural situation. Go out there and be like a hero of some sort. So, that kind of sort of libertarian thing has spread. And I think the sort of Trump world operates on some variant of it, which is that they'll point out that sort of current elites, who are the sort of, the current elites in our system were people who often espouse libertarianism, right? Your kind of corporate elites. But there's a sort of like play, they've kind of captured a lot of sort of almost like left-leaning people by using a bunch of anti-corporate rhetoric. Right, saying, oh, the existing elites kind of got there through corrupt methods. They didn't do competition properly. They weren't really doing capitalism. They were like kind of crony capitalists. And so you can have this almost like kind of semi-left wing kind of thing going on while simultaneously promoting this kind of libertarian vision of
yeah,
like true capitalism. In the crypto world, and the meme stocks were a big part of this because they were like the little guy who's being, Wall Street is like not real capitalism. It's this kind of like crony capitalism, but we're going to like band together and become this kind of like the sort of meme stock brigades. And that's like, we'll get back at them. So there are these new hybrids emerging of libertarianism with a sort of like
yeah.
people power from below. And I think maybe um,
I
this
just want to
weird,
catch a few ideas, if I may, because yeah, you brought up a few things that.
yeah, yeah, sure. I'm just,
One is this idea that what they're really engineering is an attack on kind of like the professional middle management class,
yeah,
like all the civil bureaucrats and so on. So rather than going after the corporate, sort of higher up class, that's kind of the target.
yeah,
Um,
yeah. That's
uh,
interesting. Yeah,
yeah. Uh, I just did a synopsis of one of the of a very good podcast that talked about that in depth. And then the other thing I want to say is that Union movements are actually getting revitalized apparently in the US. And also that would sort of make sense because in a way, like if you're saying that it's all about America first and you're going to bring industry back to the US, that means local workers have more stand in a way. Because the reason the whole union thing disintegrated was corporate globalization, right? Like
Yeah,
if you don't
sure.
take $2 an hour, we're just going to offshore. We'll build like a free enterprise zone,
Yeah.
in Honduras or whatever, and make the stuff there. So um, what I imagine they're going to try to do, I mean, is you know because they also now Trump is claiming they're going to deport tens of millions of immigrants, which would be catastrophic for the U.S. economy, which relies on all of that labor. But I guess you could take those people into camps and deprive them of rights, and then make them work for you, you know.
I, I mean, I think the Trump strategies, I mean, maybe I'm being naive, but I think it's just like hacked together from a range of contradictory stories that don't necessarily work together, right? So, your pure capitalist kind of like elite in a sense don't think like quite like Trump. I mean, like he's taken a bunch of things that sort of don't probably actually can't work together. Like so that sort of on the one hand an attack on the corporate class because what does the corporate class do when they want to undermine workers? They automate and they offshore,
Yeah, as I said,
right?
well, it's not so much the corporate elites; it's more like the middle management class seems to be what they're aiming at.
Well, it's actually the shareholders. I mean,
Yeah,
that's those ones who benefit from that in the end, right? So the managerial class will do that for shareholders, which is like BlackRock and crew, right? So who benefits from, the local workforce is being undercut, and it's in the end it's going to come out for the like shareholding class. Um, so on some ways, the kind of anti-immigration thing um has this, as why I said it has almost a left-wing feeling to it, except, not a true left-wing feeling. It's not like an old school socialism which believed in sort of international workers' rights. It's like, okay, American workers, and we're gonna like throw out all the outsiders to kind of somehow give you back some power that's been undermined through corporate globalization and movement of people, right? At the same time, he's trying to empower like people like Elon Musk, who are like big automation people, and then they're going to attack the working class through automation, right? That's their thing. So there's contradictions there.
right. Like
I don't actually
the
believe.
self-driving truck. When you have 3 million truck drivers in the U.S., that's like the biggest
Yeah,
workforce of people who don't have like a college degree who can actually make a decent living and so on.
that's why I don't actually think the campaign is coherent. I don't think that's really necessarily matters. I think what mattered for people was it wasn't some like the kind of middle of the road sort of centrist thing.
Yeah.
That's really the feeling I get. It's not that his actual campaign really makes sense. It's that like he's just kind of a little bit erratic and a bit like exciting in some sense, right? Which is important. And this is actually on this piece I'm doing, that my last piece of the art of crypto kayfabe, and I use the term kayfabe very deliberately because kayfabe is this term from professional wrestling, where you in the term in wrestling where the industry pretends to be doing that what it's doing is real, right? But there's an interesting thing with kayfabe, which is that actually many people in the audience do actually know that it's fake, but they kind of go along with it anyway, right? And Trump is a master of this. Everyone kind of knows that he bullshits all the time, but there's something entertaining about that process. And the reason, all the kind of like Kamala Harris and this stuff, they don't do this. They're like, oh, we're going to kind of have this sort of like staid, like presentation, like we're going to talk normally as if we are trustworthy people, but they don't come across as trustworthy. A friend of mine, Aris, was talking about this recently, just like they don't come across, they might be saying something that's real, but it doesn't feel like it's trustworthy. And in a sense, there's something about what Trump taps into, which is like there's a certain absurdity to the world and to capitalism, and he's going to play into it. He's going to do the kayfabe, and you kind of know that he's bullshitting, and you know that his plan doesn't really make sense. But still, it's entertaining and it's a bit like something refreshing. But I think there's limits to how far that goes. I mean, like at some point, people lose interest in that entertainment. They're like, okay, now my life's actually being affected by this. So I don't actually know how far is I'm like kind of morbidly fascinated to see how this combination of contradictory things can play out. I know for you, it's you're right there while it's happening.
Well,
So
I don't know. I mean, I'm looking at the Berlin artist visa. I could come and hang out with you and Berghain and stuff like that. You may see me.
you could be one of the sort of exile, the Americans in exile over here.
It is possible. I mean, I am a little concerned, because he's also, he's starting a campaign against the free press, obviously,
Yeah, nice.
and we don't know how far that's going to go in terms of, where he's going to take that. I mean, it could be interesting to leave America for a couple of years and come back and then see what it feels like. So I wanted
Yeah.
to, since I really appreciate this conversation. I really appreciate your views and insights. I'm kind of curious also because in the last piece I read, which wasn't the kayfabe piece, I forgot about that one. I did enjoy that too, but you were talking about more kind of like positive ideas about what are some real alternatives. And of course, that's kind of exciting. You mentioned my old friend Tom Greco, who I wrote about a bunch, published some of his works. Yeah. So what are you seeing on the forefront? I mean, I guess having been around this stuff for quite a while now, it always feels like the alternatives fail, and the thing that's bad just keeps getting worse and worse. But I mean, maybe that doesn't have to happen forever. You never know. There could be a surprise reversal. So what are you seeing anything out there? You mentioned a few, mutual credit clearing.
Which piece were you reading?
Oh shoot. What was it called? Um, Interesting.
Because
Uh,
I don't think it was my last piece.
Maybe it was
My
last.
last
What's that?
my last piece was on surveillance capitalism or
No, I didn't read that one.
wrapped.
I'd love to read that one. Shoot. Now I don't know where. I don't know. It was.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, no worries, no worries.
But yeah, you're talking about mutual credit clearing. Mutual credit
Okay.
systems.
Maybe. Oh,
What?
was it
What?
not zero as a future money, maybe?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, yeah.
Oh, right, yeah, yeah.
So yeah, what are you seeing as some
Sure.
embraceable options here?
Yeah, so zero as a future money is this piece where it was set up as a thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. So the as a sort of structure, like being like, sort of we have a standard system, which is the standard monetary system, which is this, big three-dimensional system I was just discussing earlier. It's got massive hierarchy. It's also very dynamic, underpinned by these big nation-state monetary systems. Bitcoin presents itself as this antithesis to that, right? It's like we're going to have this distributed but like very static like money system. It's very like rigid and like weird, right?
Yeah.
And doesn't work. And as I was mentioning, it actually becomes a counter trade object traded within the normal monetary system. But ideologically, it claims to be an antithesis to the normal monetary system. And actually, there's a synthesis that's possible where you take elements of all of those things. So you take the dynamism of an expanding, contracting credit money system or the fiat system that we have, and you take the sort of distributed nature of stuff like crypto. And so some of the most interesting movements for me over the last few years have been coming from the sort of CoFi scene, collaborative finance, and rippling credit type systems that are people trying to design. So these are these systems where you'll, I don't know how big a detail you want me to do into credit theories of money, but basically where you
Small
drop this,
detour. They can always dive in.
where
Yeah.
you drop the weird hard money fixation,
Yeah.
right? And you say, money is a system of credit between interdependent people, all right? And so and then that's an expanse that expands and it contracts, right? Like it's a dynamic system. It doesn't have this sort of fixating on this weird, hard, like limited, like concepts of limited tokens is counterproductive. It's also like doesn't reflect reality in an actual economic system. And so I think some of those interesting stuff is when you start to try to take the dynamism of a fiat system and flatten the power hierarchy, without going down this hard money route of Bitcoin. And that tends to be where the sort of mutual credit thinking comes in. So if anybody's interested in this kind of stuff, you really got to immerse yourself in credit theories of money, right? You got to stop thinking about money as a thing, right? And start thinking about money as a system of credit. And that takes a little bit of practice. It takes some doing. But once you do that, once you understand credit theories of money, it really, really opens up a lot of stuff. in terms of understanding things. So I'll park that there as a topic. If you want to explore that, that's a thing. The other thing that's also interesting me is breaking down standard progress ideologies. And in some ways, Trump and crew are one version of this, right? They've got this kind of like virulent, weird sort of nationalistic thing that's going in some ways is a reaction against standard capitalist progress ideologies around endless expansion and acceleration. They're kind of going to the sort of defensive type of thing. But I'm become very interested in how do we start to break out of or diversify our progress ideas. And this comes out of my work on cash, protecting physical cash, because my last book was all about protecting physical cash, and I get a lot of people coming at me because of that, saying, "Oh, you don't believe in progress. How could you possibly support something that's slower than digital money and so on?" Right? So I've had to do a lot of work on how do you respond to people's sense of what progress means. So that's like another big project of mine is deconstructing typical progress narratives, typical economic progress narratives. And I think there's a lot of potential in that, because I think people in general are starting to get sick of standard Silicon Valley progress stories. Like they're told that, you should always desire more and faster and more automation, etc. And I think many people don't actually resonate with that viewpoint.
Yeah, of course, on the far edge of the tech, singularity, transhumanist kind of ideology, is but I actually kind of think that maybe Musk has even said this to Trump because, as we talked about before, like, are they gonna, is Trump gonna get tired of Musk? Is he gonna throw him out or whatever? Is it like an ego battle? But I think Musk has said, look, buddy, let me run the show. I'm gonna put all the resources into artificial superintelligence. Within like 5 years, we're gonna have cracked immortality. And we're gonna get you a body that's like, you'll be back to like 35 years old in great shape, and you'll live forever. And you'll, and so just let me take over, and that's what we'll get,
Yeah,
Yeah,
that is quite possible.
yeah.
Um,
And it's not even impossible that it's possible.
yeah, it's definitely yeah. And if nothing else, the Trump moment is providing a lots of what's the word? It's creating some interesting cocktails,
Yeah,
hybrids of ideologies
yeah.
that don't fit the standard stuff. Because in some ways, from my work on cash, protecting physical cash, I was coming at from a left-wing perspective, right? So cashless society is a privatization process. It's also a capitalist automation process.
Surveillance system.
Yeah, but it's also something you'd expect in an accelerating system, right? So it's like capitalism's a bit like a kind of like an Ouroboros snake that eats its own tail to try to shed its skin.
Mm.
So it's constantly trying to like push stuff that's slower out. So the
Yeah,
cash system, of course, it's like destroy this slower thing that once was our old skin. you know,
yeah,
like that's kind of like the sort of, and then that manifests ideologically on the ground. There's a bunch of anti-cash rhetoric and people being like, oh, it's so inconvenient, whatever. Like this is what happens in the capitalist system. And in some ways, people who aligned with me, I get lots of Trump supporters who would come to me being like, "Oh yeah, we're also pro cash." I've had lots of this over my years of doing cash work, realizing that in this new right are lots of people who have an inherent concern about basically capitalist automation and acceleration processes. They sense it. There's like something insecure about a capitalist system. They're like, we don't like these big tech players. We don't like what they do to us. And they were actually captured by lots of that kind of new protectionist rhetoric that Trump puts out, right? And a lot of these people were formerly left-wing people. This is what sometimes gets called diagonalism, right? This weird mix between left and right, which like Russell Brand and stuff specialize in, right? So Trump actually has captured all these people who actually at some level feel sometimes disempowered by capitalist systems, while simultaneously like hiring people like Musk who are like hyper like utopian capitalists, where they're like, we will automate everything and like create immortality and
Or
go to the
maybe
moon.
dystopian capitalists is close.
Yeah, exactly, exactly. So it's a really like crazy mix, right? So um, if I'm being dark about it, then it's like, okay, what's probably happening here is a new phase of capitalist accumulation where a new elite's going to use the crisis of an old elite to grab power for themselves whilst maintaining that they're actually doing it for the working classes, which is quite a fashy sort of thing. That's a very classic fascist move,
Yeah.
right? So it's like, oh,
Also, as I said, this attack on like the middle management, like like
yeah,
what Musk did to Twitter, where he took out all the people who were like doing
yeah, yeah,
content moderation, and so you centralize it, you streamline it, and actually now with AI, for a lot of these systems, you really are only going to need like a tiny fraction of the
yeah.
people that you once needed.
And this is a
What
very
what all
like
those people do? What's
this is
that?
a this is a very fascist, this is where the fascist analysis partly comes in because historically fascist movements did this. They would play on working class spheres to actually install like a new sort of capitalist elite and anti-worker stuff. They would destroy unions and they would do all this stuff to actually break worker power, whilst being like making out that they were actually the sort of new um and it wasn't free market capitalism. And this is the mistake that a lot of people make when they think about these systems. They're like, oh, well, but capitalism is when you have free markets. It's like capitalism is when you have certain people owning things and other people having to work for them, right? Like, and you're stuck in this kind of market vortex in the process. You can
Yeah.
do that with authoritarian elites. You
I
can do
just
it.
I just read the new book by the president of Heritage Foundation, who was one of the architects of Project 2025.
Mm.
And yeah, it's a pretty intense read, but yeah, he basically says that this whole Milton Friedman free market idea was completely wrong. And yeah, that's not they're jettisoning that now. It's much more about controlling the economy, but also and we'll see, as we said, there's different factions because obviously the Musk faction, RFK, they're not religious zealots, but these
Yeah.
guys are also like, we want to this is going to be a pious Christian nation, and we're going to force, prayer in school, and he wants to actually not only destroy the Board of Education, but if possible, seize the endowments of Ivy League schools like Harvard and so on, and
Mm.
shake out all the progressive liberal kind of thinking, and build like a whole new system just based on Christian nationalism. You know?
Yeah. Well, that's the sort of that's the fascist side of
Yeah.
that. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I suppose it depends on the strength of the US civil society culture and stuff. Because I mean, that's that ability to do that depends on, your political organism that you're in. In South Africa, where I'm from, we actually have quite a strong civil society culture, right? So this is, South Africa is way poorer than the US and stuff, but the government actually has limits to what it can do because there's pushback. People actually do, especially post-apartheid South Africa. Um, there's quite a strong sense that like you can't mess with us, but you can slowly erode that belief over time. If you cross the border into Zimbabwe, for example, people that belief has been eroded. You don't have people, but basically just sort of are often cowed down by these political systems. And I suppose in the US, the thing is like, would a increasing authoritarian regime be able to essentially crush that spirit that you find historically in the US, where people will sort of push back at certain points? Um, I don't know. I mean, the US has a lot of capitalist elites who
Yeah.
might not like certain things that are going on and who might start forming counterpower.
Yeah.
And
Well,
that's
ultimately, also, I mean, Trump himself and all these people are going to be very responsive to the stock market. So if
yeah.
if they gut, Americans' capacity for like business innovation and all that kind of stuff, um, I mean, yeah, I mean, I always go back to my little personal history and thinking about how like, my first book was on psychedelics and shamanism. And if I'd been living in Russia and China, that book would never have even been published. And, that book and a few other things, I think, started to catalyze like a shift that ultimately led to like now it's like, a multi-billion-dollar industry in
Mm.
psychedelics. So it's now fed the capitalist machine, which was not obviously my intention, and I'm not really happy about the development. But yeah, so if you don't allow for free thinking and innovation, you ultimately will, saw off the healthy branch upon which your thing is growing, I think, you know.
Yeah. Yeah.
Anyway, weird
Yeah.
times. Let's
But
do this again soon. Maybe it'd be interesting to do like a triangulated conversation, maybe with you and me and Rushkoff or something. Uh,
yeah. I
could
mean,
be
I'm going to be doing more. I mean, basically, I'm re-entering the crypto debate because of this new thing. I was stayed away from it for a few years, but now I'm feeling motivated to get back into it and to start to form, I'm always interested in talking to people who's trying to form some kind of like counterpower to these sort of new big crypto narrative that's going to start coming out.
yeah,
Um, Empowering more progressive forms of crypto. I'm not against, underlying decentralized technology concepts, right? But the current version we're seeing now is like a swampification. There's like an enshittification of crypto that's gonna occur under Trump, and I think we need to start forming counterpower against that. But also to start to study like how it works with his ideology and his narrative, and I think it's quite important ideologically for him.
right. Well, then you
Um,
also have like whatever has happened with Ethereum and Vitalik Buterin and that whole squad. Um, I mean, that thing is still holding value, but I don't understand what it's doing.
yeah,
Uh,
maybe that's for another conversation.
yeah, another conversation.
Because I have to, I
Okay.
have to, I have to, I have to cook. I have to cook my
Yeah, yeah, you
Christmas dinner.
cook your duck. Great to see you and good to chat. And we'll have a great. We're talking right before Christmas. Have a great Christmas, and we'll
Yeah.
be in touch soon.
All right. Cheers, Daniel.
Peace out.